All right, welcome everybody. This is our talk on, it's called Nothing is True, Music in the Assassin's Creed franchise. Last time we spoke on Final Fantasy VII, and it turns out that all of us have played a different number and a different focus of Assassin's Creed games. We wanted to have a quick chat about this cool franchise that we all like. So, some introductions, first of all, for those of you who have not encountered us online before. We all stream Thursday nights from 9 to 11 Eastern and talk about video game music, mostly whatever games we happen to feel like playing that week, and occasionally we become more organized than that, but that's roughly what it is. And we'll do some quick introductions and then get into talking about Assassin's Creed here. I am Ryan Thompson. I'm an assistant professor in the Games and Interactive Media Department at Michigan State University. And I am the game audio specialist / musicologist there, where I teach how to listen to game audio for game designers so they can talk to musicians and not sound silly. And every once in a while I teach some wise implementation and early stage composition as well. And then when I'm not wearing that hat, I also help teach the esports stuff at Michigan State. Just a really lucky kind of dream position for me. And then we'll kick it onward to Dana Plank just beneath me here.
You didn't say what games you'd played in the franchise, Ryan.
Oh, enough of them. That is the answer to that question.
Enough. Almost all. Hi, I'm Dana Plank. I am a musicologist, and I focus on video game music and identity, particularly disability and gender and sexuality, as the implications for the sound and the music. And so I teach a bit of college. I'm also a violinist, so I actively gig. And beyond that, I've played exactly one Assassin's Creed game, and it was Origins. And it's because I have a bit of an Egypt thing. And when this game was announced, I got 27 separate, I counted them, 27 DMs from people saying, Dana, this game's going to be in Egypt. So there was a lot of excitement. I was very excited. And so I played the heck out of this game, but I haven't done any of the others. And with that, I pass the baton to Julianne.
I catch the baton. Oh, man. Hi, I'm Julianne Grasso. I am an assistant professor of music theory at Florida State University, where I just started this year, so trying to get my bearings. And in trying to get my bearings, I have not yet played an Assassin's Creed. I thought maybe I'll play one, but I think that for this panel, I am going to kind of have this sort of newbie reaction to the Assassin's Creed series as my colleagues kind of talk about it. But I have played other games, I swear, as many of you probably know, so I may have something to say. With that, I'll kick it over to Karen.
All right. Hi, I'm Karen Cook. I'm Associate Professor of Music History at the Hart School, where I am coming to you from Central Connecticut. On the one hand, I'm a medievalist, and I do a lot of work on 14th and 15th century music. And then on the other hand, I do a lot of video game music study and film and television study. Largely, in large part, from the perspective of how modern media depicts the medieval past. So my areas overlap quite a bit in the middle. I apologize if my voice is a little bit off. I'm recuperating from COVID as we speak. I do not recommend 0 out of 10. Please wear a mask. I have played all of the Assassin's Creeds. This is my jam. So I'm really, really excited for our panel tonight and to talk a little bit about 3 of the games that are near and dear to my own heart. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and get us started, because my contribution to the cause this evening is a little bit of my work on the Ezio trilogy. So the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th games that were released in the franchise. Assassin's Creed 2 came out in 2009, and then we got Brotherhood a year later, and then Revelations the year after that. So we're looking at about 10 years old at this point. If you've not played, I'm just going to give you a really brief synopsis of what's going on in the trilogy. So if you're familiar with the game, at least the early iterations of the game, we've got this guy, Desmond Miles, who's in the modern period. And he's on the run from the modern day Templars. And through this Animus machine, he relives the memories of his ancestors. So in the first game, the very first one, he's reliving his ancient ancestor Altair, and in the Ezio trilogy, he's occupying the memories of his ancestor Ezio, who lived in Renaissance Italy. And so across these three games, the player is navigating Ezio/Desmond through the Florence of his youth to Venice, Tuscany, Forlì, and then to Rome, and then eventually even to Constantinople. So in my work on this particular trilogy, I note that the past here is really clearly rooted in real-world history. All of these towns and cities are actual places. They make use of well-known landmarks such as the Duomo, the Pantheon, the Hagia Sophia. The Knights Templar were real, as were the people known as assassins, although we don't have time to really get into the nuances of what that means. And a lot of the side characters in this trilogy were real people: Leonardo da Vinci, Rodrigo Borgia, Caterina Sforza, and so on and so forth. But the games take a lot of liberties, of course, and these historical characters have new roles that are not based in any sort of historical past. So like Rodrigo Borgia, who's also the Pope, is also the Grand Master of the Templar Order. Famous buildings have Templar tombs, and obviously all of the realities of the situation has been sort of shoehorned down into the game narrative. So these three games create this like massive meta narrative that's constantly playing with the boundaries between past and present, history and fiction. And I sort of argue that comes out in the music as well, because the sonic environment of all these games is sort of reiterating those tensions between what's real and what's fictional, what's past and what's present. And so here, what I'll mention briefly is that, obviously we've got the sounds that happen in the game, the diegetic stuff that Ezio and friends can hear. And then we've got the non-diegetic underlay, the soundtrack that we players can hear. And I want to kind of explore that for a bit. So in the non-diegetic soundtrack, what we're hearing is stuff that really establishes a geographical location, meaning we're in Italy, we're in the Renaissance chronology. So we have this general sense of time, and it tells us a little bit about whether we're in danger, whether we're safe, and what the overall mood of the scenario is. So the composer, I don't know if it's Jesper or Jesper Kid, he states that the games are a blend, since they're a blend of sci-fi and historical fiction, that blend comes out in the music. So on the one hand, he's exploring sounds of the Renaissance, so acoustic instruments, lots of lutes and recorders and hand drums. And on the other hand, to reflect the modern era, he's using a lot of rock music, synthesized samples, pounding drums, and electric guitars. So Ryan, can we hear the Renaissance soundtrack clip?
Yes, we can. Let me cue that up here.
So what we get ever so subtly in this clip is just what sounds like a plucked harp, something that's very modal, something that's sparse, something that's repetitive. And that's largely meant to evoke this sense of the Renaissance, this sense of pastness, and to sort of place us very, very broadly in Italy. But when, and this is of course occurring during a moment where we are in no danger at all, we're very safe, we're exploring an area. When we get into a situation of heightened tension and danger, though, the orchestration shifts much more toward the modern day synthesized sounds. Could we hear the diegetic shift clip?
Yes, give me 1 second here.
Great.
All right, Ezio, you're familiar with counterattacking, but what happens when your enemy is as well?
I don't usually give them the opportunity.
Tough talk offers little protection against Templar steel.
Then by all means, Maestro, teach me what to do.
Now dodge. Filio di Troia! Enjoy the ride down to hell. Bene, bene. Now do it again. Much better.
So what we heard there is, as the instruction was happening, we heard this of soft, modal, plucked instruments, and then the minute that it became a battle scene, even though it's a trial, we hear the shift toward the pounding drums and the more synthesized instruments, and that reflects the more modern era, and you hear that throughout the game. Diegetically, though, the stuff that we're hearing in the game contains multiple references to the Renaissance itself. And I could, if I had more time, I could speak about what things like birds and horse hooves and speech tell us. But musically speaking, we get two polar opposite reflections of the Renaissance musically. On the one hand, we get plain chant. And obviously that's a sacred tradition from the Catholic Church. Most apropos for games that have this religious connotation, which Renaissance Italy does. And that plain chant happens only briefly. So at one particular moment, Ezio has to scale the Duomo. We've got to be in Florence and climb up the dome to assassinate a priest. And as Ezio reaches the top of the Duomo, he hears the priest chanting somewhat poorly in Latin. So can we hear priest chant?
Yep, I'm on it. Hold on one second.
Servemur ab omnibus periculis ad glorificandum te, qui es unicus victoriae largitor, propter merita unigeniti filii tui Domini nostri Iesu Christi. Amen. Pater noster, qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum. Fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra.
So what we get in this brief instance of plain chant is something that is meant to set a general scene of this is happening in the past. This is an ancient tradition. It's a religious tradition. But it also represents, among other things, a sense of peace or safety, but also the presence of fear, evil, death, or the occult. And so in this brief scene, this chant is reaffirming sort of all of these different symbolic resonances. The priest feels like he's safe up there. He's praying, but he's also an evil person. Ezio brings him death and peace at the same time. On the other hand, we have the music of the minstrels. So as Ezio is exploring the various Italian cities, singing lutanists will often run up to him and block his path in the hopes that he'll give them coins. And some of these quests, they're a big impediment, and you have to deal with them in order to continue. If you stop to listen to them, you'd hear something kind of odd. They're not singing actually any sort of Italian Renaissance songs, but heavily accented English, if anything. So could we hear minstrels?
Mm-hmm.
That died so fine, does not find and see the great head lay low.
I've put something down the front of my dress. Care to discover the other side?
So what we heard there is we're hearing sort of nonsense language or some sort of, lowbrow Italian. It's not a real Renaissance madrigal or anything that a minstrel might have been singing in Renaissance Italy. But later on in Revelations, Ezio himself also has to masquerade as a minstrel, and he has to play kind of in the same style as these minstrels, recounting some of his greatest deeds while kind of putting down some of the big people. Could we hear Lute 2?
Lute 2. Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
The things I do to save the world surprise me time to time. Like learning how to play the lute and making these words rhyme. I sing in Italiano, you understand no word. But my Greek is non-existent and my Turkish is absurd.
So what we're hearing there, obviously, is, he's kind of making these little puns, these little punny songs as he masquerades around as a minstrel. And if you follow this particular quest through, he will actually break off the neck of his lute and use it to assassinate the final target. No spoilers, sorry. So basically, just to sum up, what I'm looking at in these three games is how the multiple layers of sonic material kind of work actively alongside the narrative and the visual elements to construct this interactive world that's both believably historical and totally fictional. And it's a world that simultaneously exists both in the past and in the present. And so I'm arguing that plays out through all of the different sonic and musical choices, both in the non-diegetic underlay and also in the choices of diegetic music that the players create, or the characters create or can hear themselves. So that's where I will leave my contribution for the evening. And we're moving on to Dana now, right? Is that correct?
Yep.
Uh-huh.
Very good.
And Origins. So I made a PowerPoint.
Dana's always the responsible one, everybody.
I'm not confident enough to talk without one. So I'll have Ryan pull that up. Oh, good. So there you
Dana,
go.
I am going to have you just cue me on slides. I'm managing enough on the computer. I can't read the script and do it at the same time. Just cue.
All right, jump to the next one then.
Yes.
Also, it looks like your Discord to us is still the VLC,
yes,
so you might want to switch
Let
that.
me be very nice to everybody who's on this call and let them see. It would be nice of me if I let Dana see the PowerPoint that she's working from, isn't it? That makes some sense, doesn't it? All right, here we go. Sorry about that,
right.
team. Dana,
No
let me know
worries.
if you are all set.
I'm seeing... There we go. What?
I'm going to jump a slide here.
There we go.
Do you see things
Slide
now?
2. Yes, okay.
Excellent.
Assassin's Creed Origins was the 10th major installment in the franchise of action role-playing games designed by Ubisoft, and the game takes place relatively late in Egyptian history, near the end of the Ptolemaic period, from 49 to 43 BCE. The story follows a Medjay named Bayek of Siwa and his wife Aya as they seek revenge for the murder of their son. Next slide, Ryan. The Medjay, or Hidden Ones in this game, are stylized as precursors to the Assassin Brotherhood, connecting this story to the lore of the franchise as a whole. Next slide. Oh, sorry, I'm moving too quick. Go back one.
You got it.
There we are. Layla Hassan relives Bayek and Aya's memories through an adapted version of the Animus. Many players today argue that the Animus has become somewhat of a dead weight in the plots of the modern games, sequences that disrupt gameplay immersion and are not very well developed relative to the historical sequences. And Origins in particular seem to draw criticism in the fan forums that I looked at for a lack of compelling connection between the two timelines. Yet this device remains fundamental to the construction of these game worlds, no matter how many playable modern sequences foreground this futurist technological framing. So as I'm going to argue in this short presentation, even if the game completely did away with the Animus as an explicit plot device, the musical emphasis on hybridity and juxtaposition throughout the franchise that we just saw with Karen's presentation will continue to serve this narrative and immersive function. In other words, to me, the music is the Animus. In the case of Origins specifically, the digital manipulation of the score appears to be foregrounded to not only fill in for the relative lack of modern-day sequences, but to imply the exoticism and ultimate unknowability of the true music of ancient Egypt. Now, next slide. Sarah Schachner's emphasis on hybridity made her a fitting choice for Assassin's Creed, which has always featured musical juxtaposition of historical and modern, epic and intimate, recorded and digitally altered. In an interview with Ronnie Mraz, Schachner spoke frankly about her playful, improvisational, intuitive compositional process as it came to inform her work on major series such as Call of Duty and Assassin's Creed, and it echoes this combinatorial emphasis from earlier scores throughout the series. She said in this interview, manipulating audio and sampling my own source material is a big part of my process. Sometimes I'll use an instrument not for its intended purpose, but more as a sound design. Scraping the resonator of a banjo, for instance, makes a great top frequency layer for a variety of sounds. Mraz asked specifically about her origin score and whether the synths or the traditional instruments came first in the process, and she responded, and next slide, I believe I have this written out. It's never a linear process, and I treat everything as a sound source to process or transform. Sometimes you can manipulate an acoustic sound into something that sounds synthetic. In the main theme of Assassin's Creed Origins, many people thought the repeating riff was a synth or a horn of some sort, but it's actually a viola with distortion and filters. I like playing with people's perception like that. I'm trying to elicit an emotional, visceral response with sound. Schachner's quote resonates with my own work. Next slide. As I once wrote in a chapter on an early example of musical exoticism of ancient Egypt in video games, the musical gestures that represent ancient Egypt are ultimately stereotypes, inventions that try to distill and recreate emotional experiences evoked by coming into contact with ancient Egyptian artifacts, settings, and stories. In this clip that we'll show from Schachner's reorchestration of Ezio's family theme from Origins, a theme that has served as a kind of a symbol of the series or recurring leitmotif, we can clearly hear that famous riff on the viola that permeates the musical texture of the game. Let's hear that clip.
Yes, give me 1 second here. Here we go.
As Alpha Ward Brown writes of this arrangement, here the original motif is rhythmically augmented and decorated with microtonal inflections that carry a characteristic Middle Eastern sound. Schachner's choice of instrumentation demonstrates a partial emphasis on historical and geographical accuracy. Nevertheless, the semiotic link to an exotified ancient Egypt that is primarily understood through mystery and mythology suggests a signification rooted in firmly habituated Orientalist associations with this historical period linked to wider cinematic and pop cultural depictions. End quote. In the case of ancient Egypt, there is no verifiably real exemplar that we could encounter and reference. No musical notation survives from ancient Egypt, and so composers either have to connect depictions of musicians on tomb walls to modern instruments, or invent their own traditions entirely to represent this sense of mystery. And often they consult previous representations of ancient Egypt, creating recognizable musical symbols through reuse. These representations are all about the unknowable, what's lost in the archaeological record. So as I wrote in the same article, whereas many of the complicated webs of meaning in the field of musical exoticism arise from claims of inauthenticity, of imagination that creates images without fidelity to the truth of a particular musical culture, representation of ancient Egypt is by necessity cut from whole cloth, whether the diaphanous and transparent linen of court dress depicted in tomb paintings or the opaque, resinous, protective gauze that wrapped Egypt's deceased. Next slide. In an interview with Paula Parisi for Billboard, Schachner echoes this compositional challenge. She says, "We don't actually know what the music really sounded like. Historians and archaeologists have ideas and can make assumptions based on later time periods and what is known about instruments of the region, but it's not like we have recordings. I wanted to create a hybrid sound of old and new, with an air of ambiguity and mystery to represent this otherworldly culture that was so immersed in mythology." Therefore, Schachner combined synthesizers with ancient instruments such as ouds, lyres, lutes, bells, and winds that, as she said, always bring you back to the sand, and that were processed in ways to make them less obvious. In a later interview, she gets more specific about the toolkit. The original plan was to acquire a Yamaha CS80, but that proved difficult. She ends up with a Roland Jupiter 6. This provided many of the synth sounds from low drones to ambient detuned bells and arpeggios. A recurring, eerie, Egyptian-esque desert drone in the soundtrack is from a reverb module she had in her Euro-Rack modular synth setup. Turning the feedback all the way up on it made it self-oscillate at a specific frequency that she modulated in different ways. So thus far, we've seen the analog instruments as well as their digital manipulation that places this music in the realm of the futuristic and the technological, the realm of the animus. What else beyond the use of ouds and other instruments grounds it in ancient Egypt? Next slide. The devices of musical exoticism are often quite familiar to listeners through repeated exposure in other media. So this will be quick. Timothy D. Taylor's list of exoticist signifiers from beyond exoticism, Western music in the world, is a good starting point. He mentions, among other things, the use of chromaticism, dissonance, avoidance of a tonal center or lack of goal orientation to give the work a lost or wandering vibe, and metrical changes or rhythmic ambiguity, among others. All of these tend to disorient the Western enculturated listener as to where and when we are. Derek B. Scott's list, From Orientalism and Musical Style in Musical Quarterly, adds a few other markers to look out for. Melodic motion, including arabesque turns in direction, melismas, ornamented lines, and sliding or sinuous chromaticism, as he calls it. Harmonic inflections, such as drones, pedal points, and chords of uncertain duration or harmonic direction. And rhythmic alterations, such as triplets in duple time and repetitive rhythms. Next slide. You don't need to hit every box on the checklist to properly evoke the exotic. As I've written before, these codes often overlap, and not every musical device is inherently exotic in character, especially if heard in isolation. Instead, devices combine with each other and with extra musical materials such as game graphics to construct the exotic for the listener. Some of the best examples of these devices in motion, both the exotic gestures implying the ancient world and Schachner's own digital manipulations of the analog to represent the technological link to the past and the animus itself, are the tracks associated with the open desert spaces in the game. Vast stretches of sand for the player to traverse and explore. So in the next clip, we're going to look at Desert Delirium, which uses nearly every instrument mentioned in the previous discussion. Prominent bells open the work with heavily distorted and digitally manipulated strings against an ominous low drone. Ouds or other lutes ring out, and a textless voice adds a sense of the unknowable, untranslatable ritual and magic. The music lacks regular metrical emphasis and seems to stretch out into the timelessness of the desert. Toward the end, we get a strange yet amorphous pulsating gesture against the voice that gives motion without meter, closing out the track as it fades into obscurity. Go ahead and play the clip. That's probably good there, Ryan. Music is a temporal art, unfolding in process, implicating memory. It is also a spatial one, reflecting and resonating across the spaces in which it is performed. So how does one capture that music which has fallen silent, instruments entombed and preserved, severed from those who can animate them and send their sound waves ringing out? How can Ptolemaic Egypt's music resonate back across the Nile Delta when it was long ago carried off into eternity like an echo across the wind-swept sand? I opened with an argument of the foregrounding of the digital manipulation in this score, which in particular serves both to represent an unknown and inaccessible other musical practice. Alva Ward-Brown, in exploring the music of Renaissance Florence in Assassin's Creed II, seems to come to the same conclusion that I do. She writes, the association between Renaissance Florence and a sense of pastness is arguably a further expression of the notion that this is a familiar non-fictional space that's being accessed in-game, through the framing capacity of the animus rather than authentically lived. The spectral and echoic quality of the vocal melody reinforces this idea, implying a degree of literal acoustic separation from the player that signifies a metaphorical distance from a framed past. The inclusion of anachronistic elements suggests a literal framing of pastness, in line with the textual function of the animus, using modern-day musical idioms to express gameplay space through a multi-layered web of complex transhistorical connection. The piece consistently reinforces the fictional framing function of the animus, which is further mirrored by the player's real extradiegetic relationship to real-world history. End quote. So maybe the score is the animus itself, this object that exists both outside of both times and places, connecting the player and the game across vast divides and bringing us along into a hybrid historical reality. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Ryan.
All right. Give me just a second to exit PowerPoint for the sake of preserving precious stream resources so that we don't just quit having this stream right now. All right. I'm going to play us, it's my job to talk about Odyssey, as you can see from the background, and I'm going to set a video of Assassin's Creed Odyssey playing, and then I'm going to mute it and talk over it so that when I play the soundtrack material in a different music thing, Twitch plays friendly with it. It's good to have video going if you're going to be doing this on Twitch as a general practice idea. So first, let's get Odyssey up and running. We'll mute this and get it visible on the stream. There we go, we're playing Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And then I'm going to open the rest of my pieces when I need to in Winamp, which I will share, or attempt to share with my stream friends here. Give me 1 second, everybody, for that to open up. You can watch Assassin's Creed Odyssey for 1 moment for me. All right. And we'll see about sharing this on Discord. Sorry about the transition between me and Dana here. We're using just different technology to make everything go. All right. Discord folks will be able to see it now as well. So, in order to conjure Greece instead of Egypt, and it's interesting to note that I always have to reconcile this in my mind. I was joking with Dana before we started giving these talks. Assassin's Creed Odyssey chronologically takes place before the Egypt game, even though I suspect that I am not alone in thinking of Egypt as older by default, because Egypt has this huge history that spans roughly 4,000 years, far longer than any other established human history on the planet. And they give us something of the tail end of Egypt's domination of world culture in Assassin's Creed Origins. They give us this overlap between Egypt and Greece that kind of leads us neatly into Odyssey from Origins, even though the chronology is actually reversed. But to create this illusion of an understood Greece in many of the same ways, I'm not going to retread Dana's arguments, which were much more eloquently stated than I came prepared to give them in any case, about how this is an understood Greece, just like the soundtrack we hear in Origins is an understood Egypt. The composers for Assassin's Creed Odyssey, who are The Flight, which is an awesome name for a team of 2 folks, primarily used the bouzouki and the hammered dulcimer to great effect to create this Greek sound. And again, we can put that in scare quotes. I'm going to play a little bit of Phoebe's theme to give us an idea of what that sounds like very quickly here. solo string instrument sound. And you hear that repeated sound that sounds like it might be a banjo or a mandolin. It's in fact hammered dulcimer in the background of this as kind of the other key instrument that puts us in Greece and not in some other space. Greece is not the only region of the world to use the hammered dulcimer incidentally, but the combination here really does help sell the illusion you're seeing as I drive Cassandra around the slums of Corinth, as it were. I'm here today to make a different argument rather than retread the Greek version of what Dana had to say about Egypt, and that is, there was a big kerfuffle, if you will, when Odyssey launched, that you could be Cassandra in the first place, with one exception in Assassin's Creed Syndicate, in the mainstream games in the franchise, where you could be Evie Fry for most of the game in Syndicate. But the box art star character had never really been a female protagonist before, and so for Odyssey to give you that choice, I'm going to pause Phoebe's music here, for Odyssey to give you that choice became a big talked about deal in the press. And I'm here to argue for Cassandra as the main character of Odyssey rather than Alexios. And I want to do that by noting the third big kind of hook instrument that the soundtrack uses, and it's Emma Rohan's voice as the featured soloist to the score, which shows up continuously and kind of brilliantly all across this soundtrack. Let me play you just a little bit of this. Is the track called Odyssey. I'm going to jump ahead the tiniest bit here for the sake of time so we can take some questions. Here. I'm going to turn this down so I can speak over it a little bit in the way we do on our Thursday night streams for the sake of time. The vocalist is tremendous, but it is notable to me that in a game where we can choose a protagonist, that the only solo vocalist in the soundtrack is a woman. And Emma Rohan's voice shows up in the soundtrack in a couple key locations, in Corinth, in Kefalonia, as Odyssey, one of the main core themes of the game, and most importantly for me, is, and you all will laugh at me, but as you idle on the menu screen, you hear this tune, which is Jesper Kid's Ezio's Family. And it also shows up in other big, plot mic drop moments of the game, right? The Wolf of Sparta is my father. Boom, this track, right? And who shows up here to really create the sound of Greece in Assassin's Creed, but Emma Rohan, right about 4 measures from now. We'll give it just a moment. The idea that we use the music to subtly perhaps suggest that we should be choosing Cassandra as our main character comes as no surprise to me, given that the Flight's previous project that they worked on, though they are not the lead credited artist, was Horizon Zero Dawn, with primary composer Joris de Man, and with support from the Flight. I want you all to imagine that hammered dulcimer rhythmic sound convert that in your minds to a tremolo string section, and then listen to the equivalent work describing one of Aloy's conflict sequences from Horizon Zero Dawn. Another game I will note where we are in many ways temporally displaced and creating an imagined sense of time and space relative to our real-world fiction, but perhaps in the opposite direction that the Animus is utilized. Underneath that cello, do we hear what could become the hammered dulcimer in Odyssey in the strings? It created a fascinating linkage between these two games, which are kind of the two unique games of this hardware generation that have stellar female leads, something the industry is still sorely lacking in. Jump ahead so the main bit comes in here. So, in short, again, without rehashing Dana's argument, which I could give a slightly more developed version of, but I would really just be walking in her footsteps to do so, and replacing Egypt with Greece in as many instances as I need to. I wanted to make a separate argument about how music can be used to promote other narrative ideas in these soundtracks and these game spaces. And that's what I've got for you. So that is about the end of our presentation, but we have about 4 to 5 minutes, as I understand it. And I would love to take a couple questions from the Twitch audience, which I know that Dana and Julianne can see. So I'll invite them to read them to the rest of us, and we can kind of see what's floating in the waters here. Thank you for listening to us, though. We appreciate it.
So much.
I'm clapping at you because I didn't do anything, but I can. We do have one question so far, which is there a setting that hasn't, from Darth Plagueul, by the way, hello. There's a setting that hasn't yet been used for an AC game that you'd like to see based on what the potential for the music could be. So maybe think about your arguments here in that question.
My answer's easy in that I would go back to non-Ptolemaic Egypt, because Ptolemaic Egypt is, the Ptolemaic dynasty was Macedonian Greek in origin, and there's a lot of hybridity happening in the culture. So I'd love to see, something maybe set in Akhenaten's reign, where you're talking to NPCs who are, getting into the political intrigue of, switching to the monotheistic system. I think that would be really fascinating.
My answer is, and it's a time period that we have visited. In fact, it's the time period Karen largely spoke on. But I want to see the Protestant Reformation in Germany as a setting. There's a lot of potential for violence and intrigue there. Not that I'm all about like Martin Luther stabbing a person or anything, but there's potential for plot coolness there, and a lot of kind of this late middle Baroque period pipe organ music that I adore and love and come to from a long-standing tradition with both my musicology degree and my church background. I think it'd be just a really fun setting for me. Karen, Julianne?
I have too many. I have so many. Yeah, I have so many thoughts. Like on the one hand, my medieval self wants a whole Assassin's Creed game set right in the Papal Schism in Avignon, where you've got the dueling popes, and it would just be like the perfect place for all of this like intrigue, like Ryan was saying. I think that would be amazing. But on the other hand, I'm really like I'd love to see games set, say, like in Australia or something like pre-colonial Hawaii. Would be amazing. Just to get a chance to really delve into some different kinds of histories and explore different kinds of musics. I mean, obviously, anytime we're dealing with like a non-European / American Western culture, there's a lot to take into consideration that these games do. And so we'd have a lot of the same questions about, what did the music really sound like or whatever have you. But just in terms of generic scenarios, that those would be kind of on my wish list. And there's so much of Africa left to explore, like Egypt just is a little tiny bit. So that's what I would say.
I don't have an answer for this because I had a different question, but I think we're sort of running out of time. But if maybe someone could answer in like 1 second. My question for all of you was, we talked a lot about historical representation and just like passages and all of these things, but how, my question is, how does this kind of relate to some gameplay elements? So adding in aspects of gameplay, do you feel like, I think we had a really good question earlier too, from Ian Martin about like, are the ambient chords in that game, in Karen's, forget which one you were talking about, are they just for the player versus the kind of diegetic music, and how does that influence gameplay?
Some of Karen's
that directed
material
to
was
anybody,
diegetic, and some of it was non-diegetic. We'd have to get into the specifics of what was going on. Most of the lute playing and the minstrel stuff, Ezio can hear that and is physically bothered by it, for instance. But it's hard to pin down the specific.
This is the priest murder moment. Like the difference between the chant and the like clearly they're quite different, right? And they're happening at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah. And that happens not infrequently in some of these games. Like there's and especially in the later games, even as technology gets better, there's often big periods of like overlapping musics. And if the question is how does that affect gameplay, I think on the one hand it reflects gameplay, because it's going to reflect what the player is doing and whether you're safe or in danger, or just to be very, very generic. But then that also, tells the player what you need to be doing. Are you trying to achieve a goal, or are you trying to go someplace and get healed up, or are you, what is it that you need to do? And sometimes I think the changes in the musical timbre and texture and speed and all of that, are going to instill in that player a need to move on and accomplish something, right? So, I mean, it's sort of a pat answer, but, anytime you have those sorts of changes in music that cue you to something, you have to figure out, how are you going to respond to that? So,
yeah, I'm going to note that we are officially out of time before the tech team kind of pulls us away. If anybody wants to talk more about music theory, musicology, and music in video games, all of us exist on the VGM Together Discord. I am at Bardic Knowledge on Twitter. Dana is at Musicologists. Julianne is relatively recently just at Julianne Grasso. And Karen is at CooksterKC, which I'm going to invite Dana to start typing into chat for me if she has that up.
Yeah,
we are
in here.
We got them all. It's
already done.
Nice. And otherwise, I just want to say thank you all for coming to attend and hear us talk. It's always an absolute privilege to speak to people who are really invested in this material. So thank you so much. And
thanks for having us, folks.
Thank you.
We're looking forward to the rest of the concerts and panels. Bye, team.